Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Fujifilm XF 16-50mm 2.8 to 4.8, a compact general-purpose zoom for X-series cameras. Announced in May 2024, it's the official replacement for the 12-year-old XF 18-55, and also becomes a new kit zoom option for the XS20, XT5, and the new XT50, which was launched alongside it. Now, the old XF 18-55 was an enormously popular lens, legendary in fact, so the new 16-50 has a tough act to follow. I tested a final production sample on the new XT50 to see how it measures up. Now, bought by itself, the new lens costs around $700 or pounds, which is much the same as the old XF 18-55, but in a kit it only adds around $400 or £350 to the body price alone. But if you're thinking about buying the lens by itself, you should also consider Sigma's 18-50 DCD-N from 2021 with its constant f2.8 aperture, available at a lower price of $550 or £479. I've got a separate review of that lens if you're after a comparison. Measuring 64mm in diameter and 71mm from the mount, the new XF 16-50 is essentially the same size as the previous XF 18-55, but at 240 grams it's an impressive 70 grams lighter. Meanwhile, Sigma's 18-50 is a little narrower at 60mm, a little longer at 76mm, and 48 grams heavier. The WR in the full title stands for weather resistant, with the 16-50 now sealed against dust and moisture, including a rubber grommet at the mount. This is a key upgrade over the older XF 18-55, which sadly wasn't sealed. Meanwhile, Sigma's 18-50 is only sealed at the mount. The XF 16-50 looks a lot like the XF 18-55 and also shares 3 control rings. Closest to the mount is a free spinning, unlabelled ring with clicked steps. Set the switch alongside it to the diaphragm icon and it'll control the aperture. Set it to A and the aperture control is performed by the body, with the chance for quieter adjustments. I'd personally have preferred a traditional labelled aperture ring with hard stops instead, but the older XF 18-55 had the same free spinning ring, while Sigma's 18-50 lacks any kind of physical aperture control at all. Next up is the zoom ring, which mechanically adjusts the focal length between 16 and 50mm, although unlike the 18-55 and Sigma's lens, the zooming takes place internally, so there's no extension of the lens barrel. The third ring is a free spinning manual focusing ring, which is fairly narrow but turns smoothly. Meanwhile, at the end of the barrel is the same 58mm filter thread as the 18-55, and like that lens, Fujifilm also supplies a petal hood that twists onto the end or reverses over the barrel for transportation. Sigma's 18-50 has a smaller 55mm filter thread and it also comes with a hood. Moving on to range, the new XF 16-50 starts wider than either its predecessor or the Sigma, with an equivalent of 24mm versus 27. Meanwhile, at the long end it matches the Sigma, while the XF 18-50 reaches a tad further. I personally find the wider starting point more useful than zooming a little bit further at the long end. All 3 lenses start with a maximum aperture of f2.8 at their wide end, but only the Sigma maintains this throughout the range. Meanwhile, both Fujifilms have variable apertures, gradually dimming as they zoom further, with the new lens ending at 50mm 4.8 versus 55 f4 on the old one. I think it's useful to see exactly where in the range the aperture dims, so here's a sequence that I shot for you. Starting at the wide end, the XF 16-50 only offers its maximum aperture of f2.8 for the first ½ mm, gradually dimming to f3.2 at 16.5mm, then to f3.5 at 25mm, and to f4 at 27mm. As you continue to zoom in, the aperture dims to f4.5 at 43mm, then to f4.8 from 48 to 50mm. So the older XF 18-55 may start at the same f2.8 and gradually dim as you zoom in, but it stays a tad brighter than the new model throughout its range, boasting a half-stop benefit at the long end. Now for my tests, which were all performed with the new XT50, so you'll see how the lens measures up with Fujifilm's most demanding 40MP sensor. I'll start with focusing, and you're looking at the 16-50 at 16mm 2.8 on the XT50 using a central area where it's snapping into focus quickly and confidently. And now for the long end at 50mm 4.8, where again the focusing is quick and confident. Fujifilm's employing its linear motors here in the lens, which can operate not only quickly but effectively in silence too. How does this translate to video? Here's the lens again at 16mm 2.8, where you can see a slight hesitation as it pulls focus, something that I've noticed when testing video AF on many Fujifilm bodies. There's even more steps visible at 50mm 4.8, with the focus pull lacking the confidence of the focusing for photos, at least in this test at close range. Now this is more an issue with how Fujifilm bodies refocus for video though, and I've got another example later on that's more successful. Next for focus breathing, starting at 16mm, where I'll manually focus the lens from infinity to its closest distance and back again. Here you can see the field of view reduce ever so slightly as I focus closer, almost like I'm zooming in a tad, but it's unlikely to be visible on most focus pulls in practice. And now at 50mm, again manually focusing from infinity to the closest distance and back again. As before, there's a minor reduction in the field of view as I focus closer, although again you may not notice this in general use. Next for stabilisation. Unlike the old XF 18-55, the new 16-50 does not include optical stabilisation, instead relying on body-based IBIS systems to iron out any wobbles. In my test on the XT50 I found its IBIS delivered around 4 stops of compensation for still photos and allowed the lens to deliver nice stable footage when filming video. See my XT50 review for more details. Next, let's check out its performance on a distant subject with my traditional Brighton Pier test, angled as always so that details run into the corners. I'll start at 16mm 2.8 and taking a close look in the middle shows nice crisp details out of the gate with little benefit to sharpness by stopping it down. Heading into the corner sees those details soften a little, and I didn't notice any improvement when focusing in the corner instead. Closing the aperture one stop to f4 though brings mild improvements with peak corner sharpness between 5.6 and f8. Next for the lens, zoom to 35mm, roughly midway through the range, where the maximum aperture becomes f4. Starting with a close look in the middle, the details are looking pretty good, but there's mild benefits to closing down a stop further to f5.6 and maybe a tad more at f8. Returning to the f4 image and now heading into the corners shows the details becoming quite soft at the maximum aperture. Closing the aperture one stop to f5.6 greatly improves the sharpness in the extreme corners, with further improvements at f8. So for maximum sharpness across the frame midway through the zoom range, I'd recommend shooting at f8 if possible. And finally now for the longest 50mm focal length where the maximum aperture is f4.8. Taking a closer look in the middle again shows a good degree of detail, with only minor benefits to closing the aperture any further. Returning to the f4.8 image and heading into those corners again shows those details becoming gradually softer in the extremes, although closing the aperture to f5.6 does bring improvements, while closing it further to f8 sharpens the corner details even more. So in my distant landscape test, the XF 16-50 is capable of delivering decent details in the middle, with its aperture wide open, but it does benefit from closing down a stop or two to match that sharpness in the corners. Next up, a portrait test at 50mm 4.8 using face and eye detection on the XT50. Viewing the full image gives an idea of the background separation that's possible from this distance. Zooming in a little for a closer look shows the details on my face are nice and crisp, with mild blurring in the background behind me. Now sadly I don't have a similar portrait taken with the XF 18-55 f4 for direct comparison, but with a slightly longer focal length and slightly brighter aperture there is potential for a little bit of extra blurring in the background, but perhaps not as much as you hope. I do however have one taken with the Sigma 18-50, so let's put the new Fujifilm on the left and the Sigma on the right at 50mm 2.8. Now there's almost 3 years between these shots, not to mention different framing, but you can still get an idea of the shallow depth of field that's available at f2.8. Now again, it's not huge, but it's definitely blurrier. If you want more blurring and less busy bokeh, you're going to need to go for a brighter prime lens, like say the 50 f2 or 56 1.2. Many people will want to use the lens for presenting pieces to camera, so here's how it looks for video filmed on the XT50 at 50mm 4.8, where you can again see similar blurring to the previous photo example. And now at 16mm 2.8, where you'll see more of the environment around the subject, but still enjoy a little blurring in the background. And you'll also see that the autofocus is more confident here. If you're into handheld vlogging though, the lens may be wider than its predecessor and Sigma's option, but still isn't quite wide enough to be held at arm's length as seen here. By the way, this was with IBIS alone on the XT50. So if you're into vlogging, I'd go for a wider lens like the Sigma 10-18 f2.8 DCDN or Fujifilm's XF 10-24 f4. Moving on to my ornament test for bokeh and rendering, here's the XF 16-50 at 50mm 4.8 from its closest focusing distance, where you can see the lens delivering decent reproduction with some good looking bokeh blobs in the background. Often kit zooms can exhibit messy bokeh with outlining and onion ring patterns within, but I'd say it's looking pretty well behaved here. As I gradually close the aperture one stop at a time, you'll see the blobs reflecting the geometric shape of the 9-bladed diaphragm system, but it never becomes too obtrusive. To see how it compares, let's put the Fujifilm at 50mm 4.8 on the left and the Sigma at 50mm 2.8 on the right, both from their closest respective focusing distances. Here you can see the Sigma unable to focus as close as the Fujifilm and thereby not deliver as large a magnification on the main subject, but it is compensating with its larger aperture delivering similarly sized blobs, even though it's positioned further away. And just briefly, here's the Fujifilm zoom at 16mm 2.8, again as close as it can focus to the subject, where the bright aperture is delivering small but attractive bokeh blobs in the background. Which brings me to my final test, focusing as close to a ruler as I could, first at 50mm 4.8, where the lens reproduced 66mm across the frame. Sure, there's some pin cushion distortion here, but the edges are impressively well defined, given this was taken at the maximum aperture. It's also giving greater reproduction here than the Sigma 18-50, which in my test delivered 85mm across the frame. And for completeness, here's the Fujifilm lens at 16mm 2.8, again focused as close as it can to the ruler, where it delivered 167mm across the frame. This time the edges have become soft, and while closing the aperture to f8 does improve the sharpness, there's still some softness at the extremes. So for the best macro results, zoom the lens to the long end of its range. Which brings me to my final verdict, during which I'll share a selection of sample images taken with the lens on an X-T50 body. As always, you can access some of the original files via my review of the lens at cameralabs.com, and be sure to also check out my X-T50 review, which features even more sample images. For over a decade, the Fujifilm XF 18-55 2.8-4 has proven to be one of the classiest kit zooms around, delivering excellent quality with a brighter than average aperture. As such, its successor, the XF 16-50 2.8-4.8, has big boots to fill, but succeeds to become the desirable kit zoom for the next generation of X-series cameras. It may not reach quite as far as its predecessor, but most will find the wider start at 24mm equivalent more useful. And while it doesn't have optical stabilization anymore, Fujifilm does now appear to be equipping all of its new bodies with IBIS. The aperture may start at the same f2.8 as before, but becomes dimmer sooner in the range, ending at a slightly slower f4.8. But the new lens does enjoy weather sealing, that was absent on the old model, along with internal zooming that keeps the barrel compact and again helps with that sealing. It's a little lighter overall too. Now when bought in a kit with one of the recent bodies, the lens becomes particularly good value, costing as little as half of its standalone price. As such, I'd say it's a no-brainer when buying a new body, even if you just intend to sell it on sooner rather than later. But viewed as a standalone purchase, it looks expensive compared to Sigma's 18-50 2.8 DCDN, which may not zoom quite as wide, but boasts a constant f2.8 aperture throughout the range, and costs roughly 2/3 the price. So until the new Fujifilm zoom enjoys some discounting, I'd say the Sigma makes more sense for anyone looking to buy a separate general purpose zoom for an existing X-series body. But again, when subsidized in a kit, the XF 16-50 is a tough act to beat. And that's it for another lens review. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if you're interested in that Sigma zoom, do check out my separate video all about it. Now when I made that review, it wasn't yet available for the X mount, but Sigma now has a version for Fujifilm cameras, and my results apply to that version too. And finally, if you find my reviews useful, please do consider giving them a like and my channel a follow, which only leaves me to thank you for watching and bid you a fond farewell until the next one. Bye bye.